Well, welcome here, and I hope all of you had such a good day or a wonderful day in Ísafjörður, your first stop in Iceland. And if you'd never been to Iceland, you just became one of the statistics that leads to my topic, tourism. Before I start that, it's just a couple of just little things that have intrigued me. We've heard a lot of people talk about Arctic islands and so on and divisions, and it made me think very much to the division in the Canadian Arctic, where for many, many years there were only two territories, Yukon and the Northwest Territories. And then in 1999, Northwest Territories was divided into Nunavut, as we know now, and Northwest Territories, where Nunavut actually, and it was divided largely along ethnic lines, where Nunavut really represented the Inuit people and in the east, and Northwest Territories represented the Dene people in sort of the central Arctic, Canadian Arctic. And I happened to be up in Yellowknife, which is the capital of the Northwest Territories, when the division was taking place. And Nunavut, everybody had agreed that that would be the name. But in Northwest Territories, they had an opportunity here to rename themselves. And so they had sort of a write-in kind of competition to see what they should name their territory, reconstituted territory. And the number one write-in name was Northwest Territories, and that's why we have it now. But you'll never guess what the number two write-in name was, and this is probably a testament to the characters that live in the North. The number two write-in name was Bob for that. So fortunately, it is still the Northwest Territories. It's not the territory of Bob. But as I say, maybe it's a testament to the kind of characters that sometimes live and breathe in the Arctic North. One of the things I was thinking as well, and I think I've already told you, this is my first speaking engagement with Viking, and I've just enjoyed myself on this ship so much. And one of the things that I've enjoyed, at least that strikes me as being wonderful about the Viking ships, is they've got so many little nooks and crannies where you can find your favorite place. And I've seen people now in their favorite places day after day, and it's not as though they claim them, it's just that they seem to be more comfortable in those places, and I think that's one of the wonderful things about Viking. And it made me think that maybe we should compile a list of all people's favorite places. And then I thought to myself, maybe not, because as soon as you compile a list, people know about your favorite place. And maybe you've actually lost that as your favorite place as you find somebody else is occupying your seat. And then, of course, my mind took me to another analogy, to tourism. And it may start as this wonderful gem of a place where it's been quote-unquote discovered. But then it becomes known, and all of a sudden mass tourism exists there. And it's no longer the place it was in your memory, in your imaginary. And so I thought, well, that's a great analogy here in terms of what sometimes takes place with places around the world that are prone to tourism. Just a couple of words about this cover slide before I go any further. This is one of the most iconic falls in Iceland. This is Gullfoss, and this is the Golden Circle route. And this was taken from one of my trips several years ago. And at the time, I always thought that the Golden Circle route is really just a marketing gimmick. Why don't we call it Golden Circle? Some marketers sitting around a table say, hey, let's call it the Golden Circle, because I'm sure that's going to attract people to go on it because it's golden. Until I realized, of course, that Gullfoss is Icelandic for golden, the Golden Falls. And so, in fact, there is a basis for the name of this circle other than just some marketing gimmick to try to attract you in this place. And by the way, before you go any further, you can see the tourists on that rock outcropping on the left-hand side there. And that also speaks to one of the characteristics of tourism that I'll get to in one of the slides, is the sense of individual or self-responsibility for your own safety on Iceland, and how that potentially can be a challenge when many more people come to the country. So I'll start with a bit of a background on Iceland before focusing specifically on tourism. And there is some things that I'll weave from that background into the topic of tourism. And some of this background John has covered in some of his slides and presentations, and some Penny has covered as well. So I'll sort of borrow a bit, but I'll just reinforce some of that, and I'll skip over some because I know you've already heard it. This image here, just before I leave this, and you can see what we're doing is we're looking through settlement, population, geology, but then really focusing on some of the early tourism in Iceland, and then to bring us up to the so-called miracle of tourism, of Iceland's tourism, and how much tourism takes place, and why is it Iceland has taken advantage of this boom. But then I'll zoom back or pan back out, I guess, and talk about how Iceland did this in the context of destination branding or nation branding and place branding, and then finally end up with just some of the future challenges and themes for continued tourism in Iceland. This image is old sod huts near Hólar, and Hólar is sort of in the north-central part of Iceland, just south of Akureyri, where we're going tomorrow. So as John mentioned, and as you've heard in various other presentations, there's really not much of an archaeological record of human habitation or settlement on Iceland prior to about 870 AD. And the first recorded landings, I think, almost several times the first recorded landings were attributed towards people being blown off course on their way to the Faroes or somewhere else. After several explorations, settlement, and I won't call it colonization because there wasn't an indigenous population here, settlement came from Norway as well as from North Britain. And the settlers found that the land was quite useful and quite valuable for farming, for livestock, and for fishing. And so this represented sort of the typical pull factors to bring people here, but there are also those push factors, and I know I caught a little bit of John's presentation in terms of perhaps the ruling king or kings in Norway and Denmark about this time, the area of Scandinavia. Maybe they were not treating some of the chiefs and elders in the way that they could have treated them, and so this represented a push factor as well. And one of them, of course, you see this granite carving statue on the right-hand side is King Harald Fairhair. I'm not quite sure whether his hair was as flowing as it is in this. I'm sure that's probably a bit of an exaggeration. The first permanent settler, records show, is a farmer called Ingolfur Arnarsson, and there's a statue. You'll see that statue of him overlooking Reykjavik Harbor right now. And research shows that Iceland was really settled, if you look at it from sort of the settlement of the circumference of Iceland, by about 930 AD. And as John mentioned, it was often called as landnam, or land taking. And from largely two different sources, the Book of Icelanders and the Book of Settlements. And as I think you're already aware, just as in the case of the other sagas, the Norse sagas, these often weren't written until about 200 years after the fact, and often form the basis potentially for the sagas themselves, especially the Book of Settlements. Note, as with the Faroe Islands, just as a note for this, there were reports of hermit Irish monks that were here prior to the Norse landing. Just another historical note as well. One of the oldest parliaments, called the Althing, was established around the same time. You can visit it as part of the that Golden Circle route from Reykjavik at Thingvellir National Park. And I should add, you've seen some of the landscape around Iceland today, and you've seen other images already of the landscape. Well, the landscape was very different prior to the Norse cultivation or Norse settlement. It tended to be lowlands covered by forest and scrubland. And the only land mammal was the Arctic fox, and I was on the group that actually went and visited the Arctic Fox Center today, and they had two Arctic fox kits there as well. Much of the forest, or whatever forest was there, was cleared intentionally by burning prior to farming. And that was to try to create charcoal for the fertilization of the soil. Today, only about 1% of the land is forested, and less than 25% has its natural vegetation. In terms of the population changes, and this gets back to a little bit of the geology here for a couple of slides. For the first 900 years of settlement, there really wasn't that much of a change or an increase. There's about 45 to 60,000 people here at the most for that first 900 years after the Norse settled it. And then there were sort of sporadic population crashes, both probably during that period, but especially after that period, especially during the so-called mini ice age that was in the late Middle Ages, in that sort of 1500, 1600, 1700 period, 1700s period, when it was more difficult to grow the crops during that ice age. And so you found that a fair percentage of the population died probably from illnesses related to starvation and hunger, or illnesses related to the state of the climate, so pneumonia related, may even be thinking of it in terms of potentially pestilence and maybe remnants of Black Plague or bubonic plague as well. The 18th century was a bad century for Iceland in terms of population. The 1707 was a smallpox epidemic, and in 1784, the Lakai eruption took place, a volcanic eruption, and ash covered the entire island. In fact, it's been shown when you look at the climatological records that the Earth's climate decreased by about 1 degree Celsius immediately or following this eruptive. So you can just imagine the power of that plume that was able to decrease the temperature of the Earth by 1 degree Celsius. But it's estimated that 25% of the population died because the ash covering the surface obviously killed the crops, but it also affected, you couldn't grow the hay for the livestock, so the livestock died, and it was that sort of cycle as well. And one pastor at the time, and I've got this quote here, said that it was more poison fell from the sky than words can describe. I thought that was an eloquent and poignant way to describe the state of Iceland, right, and its carrying capacity at the time. So let's move forward a bit, because from about 1830 on, the population steadily increased. So you start getting more intensive fishing and more intensive farming, and then you start getting into the manufacturing period of time as well. So the current population of Iceland is about 384,000 people. As you can see from that image on the lower left, about 2/3 of that, 63%, live in that greater Reykjavik sort of area. And the rest are spread throughout the rest of usually around the perimeter of Iceland. And we're going to be visiting some of these communities along the perimeter in the remaining few days of the Iceland visit. And the other thing I wanted to point out in this, in terms of an increase in population, was the rapid increase in foreign-born people within Iceland, because I think that's really contributed towards not only sort of issues related to tourism, but also economic development in the rural area is a topic I'm going to talk about in my next talk on Sunday. So from this diagram in the upper right, you can see, if you look closely, that in the year 2000, only 2% of Iceland's population was foreign-born. And by 2024, now this goes a little few years beyond that because they're also looking at what the predicted percentage is going to be a few years out. But in 2024, almost 17% of the population was foreign-born. And that constitutes about 65,000 people. When you think about it, up until about the mid-1800s, that was the total population of Iceland. And moreover, about 1/3 of that 65,000 is from Poland. Although I'm not going to talk about it extensively now, but I may in the next presentation. Although Iceland is not part of the European Union, it is part of the Schengen area. And the Schengen area is an agreement that means that you have free movement of labor of people across all of the members of Schengen, and Poland, of course, is one of the members of the Schengen area. So you get an enormous increase in foreign-born people that have contributed immensely to the development, both the economic and cultural development of this island. And in fact, in the trip that we took today to the Arctic Fox Center, the person that was doing that was from Bulgaria, who was managing it. So as Penny mentioned in her talk, one of her talks, Iceland is on the boundary of the Eurasian and the North American plates along this mid-Atlantic ridge, and it's a divergent boundary, so that means the two plates are pulling apart. They're pulling apart only at about half an inch per year sporadically, and it can be more or less. And also, in addition to that, it's on a hot spot. On a hot spot, so this Icelandic plume you can see, this is sort of just a generic image of it in the image on the upper right here. Starts and it formed Iceland, and as I think you've heard, the Hawaiian Islands are as a result of that one of those hot spots as well. What's fascinating about Hawaiian Islands, and I know this is way off topic, is that you can actually trace where the volcanoes are, the submarine they call them proto-volcanoes or proto-islands or submarine islands, because there's one that's actually brewing right now to the southeast of the Big Island. And so if you can stick around for another maybe 100,000 years, you might see another island. You can book your package to the next Big Island. I was just kidding there, by the way. And Surtsey, of course, if you're not aware of it, is one of the newest islands. It erupted the underwater volcano, so this is one of those proto-islands that became an island in that period of about 1963 and 1967. And it was declared a nature preserve in 65. One of the fascinating things I found about this, and I know Penny couldn't talk about everything because she had everything to put in, but only scientists are allowed on this island. And it's a fascinating place. I'd love to be a scientist. If I was a scientist and was a biologist, for example, I'd love to be assigned to this because you're actually seeing how life forms on a barren island. And how it evolves on that island as well. So we see plant life that's often carried by birds that nest on the island, and that the birds themselves, as well as seals, leave their own guano or poop, and that improves the soil for other plants that come here. So remember, 1965 was it formed. By 2015, there were 74 species of vascular plants. So in other words, not simple mosses, but rather more complex plants. And then you start to see insects are coming as well, and they come here either because they float here, or they're blown here by the wind, and they become then food for birds. And so it's a fascinating place just in terms of the evolution of the landform itself. So let's now look at some of the early tourism on Iceland. As is the case in a number of northern cold water islands and mainlands, some of the earliest tourism is by the wealthy or the aristocrats. And it's actually some of our record of it is their travelogues or their diaries that they preserve and pass on for public use. And what they do is, in many of these travelogues, they speak to the wonderful nature that exists there, the appeal of nature, and the exotic people and language and culture. And think about that. It's sort of nature and culture intertwined. And this is hundreds of years ago that they're coming. And when we look at the slides coming up, you'll see that that's the same two themes intertwined that are used in the marketing campaign now. They enjoyed looking at those different and challenging conditions, but they also make mention of these exotic and pleasant people. And I thought this was a wonderful quote, this verse here by Taylor in 1829. No bellows to blow, no fuel to find, no embers to stir, nor poker to mind. They yet boil their dinner with comfort and ease, and you may dine with them whenever you please. And I guess we would call Taylor now a tourism influencer, perhaps. Some of the early notable visitors to Iceland were the Frenchman Jules Verne, and he based his journey to the center of the earth on travelogues that had been written about this. William Morris, who translated the Icelandic sagas into English, and then also Iceland formed the basis for C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, although Tolkien never visited Iceland himself. And this image at the right-hand side here is the book spine for Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. And then we come to World War II. British occupied Iceland in World War II, and this is after Iceland declared itself neutral. And Britain realized that if Iceland was neutral, there's a greater risk or threat of Germany taking over Iceland. And strategically, it's such a strategic location that Britain decided that preemptively they better take control of Iceland before Germany does. So Britain invaded Iceland in order to deny Iceland from Germany. And so you see the building of Reykjavik Airport, harbors and roads and hospitals during this period of time that the British are occupying it. There's a German general and political scientist, Karl Haushofer. And by the way, Haushofer was a very important figure in Nazi Germany because he actually wrote the justification for the expansion of German being sort of like an organism that needs to expand or die. And he was quoted as saying, whoever controlled Iceland held a revolver constantly pointed at the Great Britain, Canada, and the United States. So after the war, our airports and other infrastructure were turned over to Iceland, and Iceland gained its independence from Denmark shortly thereafter. But this served as the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure, that then went into the tourism industry, amongst many other things, of course. But tourism still wasn't a major element of the Icelandic economy. So even up until about 2010, they only had about 500,000 tourists a year, and it was still only constituted about 4% of their GDP or their economy. But two events then took place that changed that and created the Iceland we see today in terms of its tourism. So the first one was that financial collapse, the Great Recession that took place in sort of 2008 and into 2009. Prior to 2008, Iceland was actually viewed as an economic miracle, not only because of everything else they did, but because of their financial and banking system as well. Historically, they were highly dependent upon fishing, but they also received a lot of aid from the United States. And they did this not only during World War II, but also in the Cold War, because now the United States and other allies are worried about Russia having an influence, or the USSR having an influence in Iceland. So the global recession, it affected many developed countries of the world at the time. But this sort of real estate bubble, the collapse of the real estate bubble, hit Iceland exceptionally hard. Just to give you some extent of the problems, 4 Icelandic banks went bankrupt during this period. And the directors or chairs or CEOs of those banks, those major banks, went to jail. And one of them went to jail for 7 years. And 36 of them, I hope there are no bankers in the audience here, 36 were jailed in total, and for a total of 96 years in total of those 36 who went to jail. Unemployment in Iceland soared. So it went from about 3% up to about 10%. You might think, well, 10% isn't that bad. But 10% in Iceland was virtually unheard of at the time. This image, I hate to I'm not going to put too many graphs there, but there's going to be a few just so you can see the impact of some of these things. The image at the top right shows the stock market index in Iceland. And it crashed by about 80% almost immediately after the financial collapse. And in the image in the bottom left shows the depreciation of the Icelandic krona. And this showed it depreciated by about 50% almost immediately against the euro after this happened. And so we might think of this as really just a collapse of the business system. But every Icelandic business, small business and households was affected by what happened. So it affected every family, every business, not just the economy and not just the banks. So the entire society was affected. And there was a major call for a new Iceland, or the Icelandic way of responding to this financial crisis that differed from other nations. So in Iceland, they said, well, let's let the banks go bankrupt. And that was not the case in Canada or America or elsewhere. So they didn't bail out the banks. The Icelandic government didn't bail out the banks. And they recognized that the average wage was going to be much lower temporarily. But they said we needed to actually do this in order to climb out of this. And they didn't repay foreign bondholders as well. And Iceland has the distinction of being the very first developed country to actually apply for and be awarded a loan from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And so they received $2.1 billion US from the IMF in order to try to restructure their economy. And so Iceland nationalized their banks. So you can see the 3 banks listed here in the logos, whatever, in the upper right image. So they nationalized the banks. The Icelandic krona was devalued. And what that meant was that international tourism actually, it was very cheap for people to come to Iceland in relationship to some of the other competing cold water sort of tourist destinations. This image at the bottom left-hand side here, you may have heard of that if you were listening to the news at the time. These are protesters outside of Reykjavik in the plaza outside the parliament in Reykjavik. And this is called the pots and pans, or the kitchenware revolution, where people have bring their pots and pans as a way of protesting sort of the government and saying that you need to do something about this. So that was one event, the financial collapse that probably led to the preconditions for tourism being not only essential, but possible given the devaluation of the krona. The second major event is something that Penny touched on, but I'd like to focus on one of those volcanic eruptions specifically. And I know I'm going to butcher this Icelandic expression. I'm going to try it anyway. It's because I've got it up here phonetically on here, so I'm going to try it. Eyjafjallajökull la Jökull volcano in April 2010. And you can see I've got arrows here on both of these images. You can see the image on the right where that volcano was located on Iceland. Remember that slide I had earlier, Lakeeye, that remember 1784? It wasn't as bad as that, but you can see the impact of it now. Now that we're in the jet engine age, that it had a profound effect on jet travel. In fact, this had the most severe impact on civil aviation of any event, of any natural event. And I'm thinking, although I haven't looked it up, I imagine if you looked at any human event, it might have been 9/11 in terms of disruptions of civil aviation. But just some of the things that it impacted, just to give you some idea of the impact on Iceland and other European countries as well. Over 8 days, 300 airports were closed, and 104,000 flights were canceled. And that represented about 50 to 80% of the traffic in the region. In terms of Iceland flights, some flights still were able to take off to North America, because you can see if you look at that plume on the left-hand side there, although there's some of the plume goes to the west, most of the plume is around Europe, northern and central Europe. So some of them flights went to North America, but almost all of the flights to Europe were canceled. So that's over a period of 13 days. And if you look at the surveys of perception of travelers or visitors to Iceland at the time, it went from about 19% negative perception of Iceland in 3 days after the eruption to about 72% after 7 days. And tourist numbers fell by about 30% 1 month after the eruption. So Iceland was in a crisis here, both because of the financial crisis as well as the eruption of the volcano. And so they started a special marketing campaign called Inspired by Iceland. And this was implemented to try to convince tourists that Iceland was actually safe, and also to do a number of other things. So to try to increase foreign investment, bring people back, and so on. So the Icelandic government spent 700 million kroner, or $6 million US. And the themes were that this come to Iceland because this is a passive form of adventure tourism. In fact, they tried to turn it on its head and use this event in a positive spin, calling it adventures at nature's fireworks. By the summer of 2010, many of the tourists believed, if you look at surveys, believed that the eruption had added depth to their travel experience. So they were trying to change the perception or spin the perception of the event. So let's look at what's happening with tourism numbers now. It went from about 500,000 in 2010, and I'll show a slide that shows a longer time period. And that number increased exponentially throughout the next decade. And for the period from about 2010 to 2020, the tourist numbers went up about an average of 20 to 22% every year. And in 2016 itself, in the 1 year period, tourist numbers went up 39%. They crashed again in 2020 with the pandemic, from about 2 million in 2019 back down to 500,000. But in 23 and 24, they've recovered again up to about 2.2 million. So they've actually started to exceed the number of tourists pre-pandemic. In terms of more sort of images of what the conditions were like in terms of tourism, that bottom left is I thought it's a wonderfully evocative sort of message here in the image. This shows the change in numbers of passengers over that longer time period from 2010 to 2023. And you can see that impact of COVID and that dip in the numbers here. And the upper right, that row you see there, are the number of cruise ships that paid a visit to Iceland during that longer time period. And what you see here, of course, is that in the cruise ships, we were close to 200 in 2019, and it went down to just 7 cruise ships in 2020. And now it's been back up over that 200 mark in 23 and 24. I should say as well that a lot of people, governments especially, are guilty of using simplistic indicators of assessing the impacts of tourism. They often point to tourist numbers as the be-all and end-all of tourist indicators. And you really have to be very careful about just looking at tourist numbers, because it's in order to really assess the overall impact of tourism on a place, you have to be much more comprehensive. For example, how much did the tourists spend there? How involved are they what impact did they have on the environment, on the culture and the society itself? So you have to sort of look at, tourist researchers tell us we have to be much more sophisticated, although it's often tempting to just look at numbers, as I just did. But I also looked at in terms of GDP. So just one last, I think this is the last set of slides that look at graphs, is the change in the contribution of tourism to the economy of Iceland over the same time period. Remember that in 2010, tourism was only 4% of the GDP. This image at the top right here, and it goes past this. By 2013, tourism was 17% of the economy, and then it was up to 23%, or almost a quarter of the economy prior to COVID. It went down during COVID, but it's rebounded almost to the same level it was. And so it's about 20% right now. And I should say, if you compare this to almost every other European country, most European countries, even the ones that have a lot of tourism, are about 10% of their GDP. So it's about twice what other European countries are in terms of their contribution to the gross domestic product. And it's projected to actually continue but flatten out. So I talked about those 20% a year numbers. It's projected to flatten out both in terms of numbers and in terms of contribution to the GDP over the next few years. This diagram at the bottom left here also gives you an idea of the spending, the total tourism spending. It went from 311 billion krona in 2020 to just less than 1 trillion in 2023, and 1 trillion is about $4 billion US dollars. So that's a tremendous injection into the economy of a relatively small country. Remember, only 384,000 people. And that's about 1/3 of their export earnings. So how did they do it? So what was behind this Icelandic tourism miracle? So let's just step back a little bit. And I want to look at product branding just for a second, and then take that one step further and see how that relates to nation or place branding. So this is a quiz for those of you in the audience. I'm going to put some images up here, and I want the first person to shout out where they believe the place is from for this image of this company. Sweden, of course. IKEA, Sweden. In our minds, we recognize the place based on that logo and that company. What about this one? Germany, Volkswagen, of course. This one's a little bit harder. What's this image? Do you know what company this is? Rolex. And where's Rolex based? Switzerland. So it's a little bit, stretching a little bit. The first two were easy. That one was a harder test. So for products, we understand these associations. What you're trying to do with associations, especially when we get to geographical associations, is you're looking at people call it the imaginaries. You're trying to emphasize the desirable traits of a place or a product, and you're trying to downplay or diminish the less desirable traits. So a brand is supposed to be a promise. It's supposed to have dependability, and it's supposed to have consistency to it. So let's look at it now when we take this one step further and extend that branding to a nation or a place. This image, the image on the left, this is like an iconic image of a beach. The palm trees, by the way, always seem to be at a 45-degree angle. I don't know why that is. They're always at this 45-degree angle with white sandy beaches and blue azure seas behind it. And this could be sort of any. So it's not focused on a specific place. But this image here, we see that we recognize that it is the 3 S's, the sun, sand, and sea, associated often with mass tourism. But there are some countries that have actually taken this and more specific to the country, branding the country. So Jamaica is a great example of, it's not just the sun, sand, and sea in Jamaica. They're also trying to brand, they use Bob Marley and reggae as part of their brand as well. Come to the birthplace of reggae, where reggae started. New Zealand, it's the 100% pure campaign, and they've creatively used the North and South Islands as part of the percent sign here. And that 100% pure is supposed to project an image of pure nature, and that's a metaphor for the identity of the island itself. And that they also mention in there that they've used the Lord of the Rings as that association. So let's come back now to Iceland in terms of its nation branding or place branding. A new organization that was created, was established in Iceland called Promote Iceland. And that was to enhance Iceland's image and reputation, and to encourage trade and investment. And the first marketing campaign, I've already mentioned that to you, that Inspired by Iceland campaign. The objective was to revive the economy and increase foreign cash flow, and to change that negative perception of Iceland following those two factors that I mentioned to you. So what are some of the elements of this marketing campaign that Iceland engaged in? Think back to the earliest travel logs of the aristocrats when they came here. One of the elements of this new campaign is natural landscapes and Arctic, and the fact that it's an Arctic destination. It's purity and unspoiled, and also it's a safe adventure. There was a survey done in 2018 that said that 91% of tourists said Iceland's nature was one of the key reasons for them to visit, and 71% also linked it to an interest in the Arctic. And they also, the marketing campaign, tried to portray risk as an opportunity. It's that passive adventure kind of theme as well. There were a number of sub-themes that, and one of the problems with themes is that if you get too many, it waters or dilutes the message down. But there were some sub-themes. There are some sub-themes in the tourist marketing campaign that Iceland is engaged in. One of them, of course, is Viking history and Viking life, and we've seen that both in terms of the presentations on this ship, and you'll see it in some of the stops that you see as we go to as well. The second one I find very intriguing, and that's an emphasis upon the so-called creative sector in Iceland, not just sort of sculpture and painting, etc., but they portray themselves as in addition to that, as a nation of storytellers. And so they've built upon that saga era and update that to think of this is another element of the creativity of Icelanders that is intriguing to visitors. In fact, the Guinness Book of World Records, and I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I'm going to say it anyway, says that they have more authors per capita in Iceland than any other nation. And it's estimated that 1 in 10 people will publish a book in their lifetime. Now that might be self-publish, and I don't know about the quality of all of those books, but that's the prediction here. And you have this continued, as I say, the continued legacy that built up from the sagas. This is a picture I took of one of the malls. I think this might have been in a mall in Akureyri. And it's not uncommon to find these almost like little mini libraries in the shopping malls of Iceland, the major shopping malls in Iceland. It's another indicator that Iceland is trying to show you that it's not just nature and it's not just culture, but it's the creativity associated with the people that live here as well. And maybe it's part of the conditions and context of Iceland that's created that creativity, the isolation, the bonding together of people. And then they've packaged those themes as well. And so I mentioned that golden circle. Here's this map at the top here, shows that route of the golden circle starting and ending in Reykjavik. And it's about 300 kilometers or about 190 miles. And you can do it if you rent a car or on a tour bus in a day. You might not be able to stop at every one, but you can get a good maybe 3 stops in, maybe 4 stops in if you push it along that. And it covers, as you can see, some of these spots here. I've got these red arrows. It covers some of the geysers or geysers of Stalkar. Erupts every 10 to 15 minutes, for example. Even the geyser that was actually created, the generic name geyser is on this golden circle. The waterfalls, here's that Golden Falls is on the golden circle. And of course the Alping, the Parliament at Thingvellir National Park is on here, and you can walk down the path here down below and see where the Althing took place. Another innovative element of tourism marketing were engaged by some of the air carriers. Remember that Iceland is on that great circle route from Europe to major centers in North America. And so some of the low-cost carriers like WOW Airlines, which I believe is out of business now, but also Icelandic Air, started saying, well, you can stop off here and you can stay for up to 7 days without being charged any more on your ticket, your airline ticket. So you find now that Iceland is not just a destination, but it's a gateway. So it can be used, it's much more efficient. They're making it easy as possible for tourists to visit Iceland, even if it's only for a short period of time. Iceland is, as I say, is a destination, a gateway, and a gateway between tourists from North America. You can see this image on the bottom right-hand corner here, stopover in Iceland. Iceland Air actually even did a one step further in terms of their campaign, and they had something called a stopover buddy element of their campaign, where if you were stopping over in Iceland, then they would link you up with a local volunteer who would show you around the country, or at least around Reykjavik, for up to a day, free of charge. Pretty creative kind of marketing. So let's look now at, that's me saying I'm supposed to stop pretty soon, but I'm not going to stop here, okay? I'll be finishing. My last couple slides here. Despite growing negative perception of tourism in other places, surprisingly that those negative connotations of tourism, large tourism, aren't really apparent in Iceland. You see, if you look at, and I'm not going to go into the details, if you look at the statistics of Icelanders, they actually are very, very small percentage of them view tourism as a negative. And as I said, I won't go down. And actually the numbers are going down. And if you look at rural Iceland, they're even more positive about tourism than in urban or the Reykjavik kind of area. Some of the challenges, by the way, that's my son here who's taking a picture of, I don't know if that was Gullfoss or something. He's getting on the ship by there at Reykjavik. It's changed a little bit since then. One challenge is that, remember I said earlier on that Reykjavik got an advantage when the krona was depreciated? That krona is not depreciated any longer. It's actually appreciated. So Iceland is actually a fairly expensive holiday destination in relationship to other competing cold water places. The second challenge they have is the so-called right to roam that exists in many Scandinavian countries. And I'm not going to pronounce the right to roam in Icelandic, but in Icelandic law, you as an individual, whether you're a local or a tourist, have the right to set up a camp on both public land but also on private land. If you're on private land, you're supposed to notify the nearby property owner, etc., if you stay there longer than a day, but you have that right to live there, or to visit there as a camper. The problem, therefore, is how do landowners, and you're not allowed to charge a fee as well for people there. So how do landowners then, near popular sites, recoup the cost of their services or clean up those sites, especially when more and more visitors are there, and they may be more sort of less conscientious visitors, let me say. This is especially important for safety because, as I mentioned before, in Iceland, the onus is upon the individual to take care of themselves. It's not on society to take care of you. And so you can see this image on the right here, and even where my son is on the left. It doesn't take much for somebody to go over some of those rock outcroppings. And so that's a bit of a challenge. where do you find the money to actually make these safer destinations? And how does that affect the image for the locals itself? This is slowly changing, by the way, and more fees are being charged. And in fact, the new government that just came into being in late November, early December of 2024 has a new tourism policy package that allows fees to be charged, that puts constraints on short-term rentals like Airbnb, and also encourages tourism to rural areas. And so we're coming into a period in the future that's a little bit uncertain, but probably a little bit more stable in terms of the tourism sector in Iceland compared to the chaos that existed for the 10 years before that. And so that's almost the end. And I will say that I'm going to have more on tourism in rural Iceland in my next talk, but also other aspects of life and the economy of rural Iceland. And that's going to take place Sunday, June 29th, 6:30 p.m. By the way, that's just the road from Reykjavik up to Akureyri. Similar right throughout Iceland. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.